So in the previous movie, we saw how to make a database connection using MySQL Connect, and we saw how to select the database over that connection that we want to use using MySQL Select Database. Now, we want to actually move on to step 3, which is going to be to perform our database query. I'm going to do that down in the body. I'm going to do that by putting in some PHP tags and then putting in my database query. So here we are, step 3, the database query. And we use the MySQL_query function, and we pass it 2 arguments. The first argument we'll recognize as being SQL, and we learned how to write that earlier. So this statement will do a read. It will select all fields from the subjects table. And we have already told it which connection, and we re-specify that handle here right after it. And we return all of the rows that it brings back, whether that's 0, 1, or 100, those all get put into result. Now, result, it's actually called a resource. And it's going to be a special kind of database object that we'll work with, but it's a collection of rows, basically. And we'll be able to then work through those rows, and we'll see how to do that in step 4. But before we do, let's first test and make sure that we got a result back. And I can do that the same way I did before by using if there's not a result, then die. The database query failed. But if it succeeded, then we'll go ahead and it'll proceed to step 4. And step 4 is going to be use the results. Now, how do we use those results? Here I'm going to use a loop, a while loop. And you'll remember we talked about this at the very end of the loops chapter, where we talked about working with databases. We're going to get back a result. And that result, we're going to be able to grab each row one at a time out of. And we do that with the MySQL_fetch_array command. Get used to it because we're going to be using that a lot. We'll do a query, and then we'll fetch an array out of the result that it gives back. And that array is basically saying, give us a row of information. Now, I'm going to set that equal to row. I'm not doing a comparison here. It's not a Boolean. The true or false nature of this is going to be, did it succeed in finding a row and assigning it there? And you'll remember we looked at that in the loops chapter. Go back and review that chapter if you need a refresher. And as long as there's still a row that keeps getting assigned to the variable row, keep executing the loop. And the loop is going to take the variable row and get the first item and the second item out of there. That's actually the second and third positions in the array. And those are going to be in the same order that they came back from the database. If you remember when we built our database, the very first column, or 0, when we're talking about it in terms of numbers in an array, is going to be the ID. So I'm just going to skip over the ID and look at what's in the column immediately after that and the column immediately after that. I'll output each one and then go to the next row. So it's just going to cycle through. Make sure you understand that. Take a few minutes if you need to, because this is going to be very important. We're going to be using it a lot, and it's a little bit different than the way that while loops normally work. And our very last step is to close the database connection. So I'm going to come down here below the end of the HTML document, and I'm going to put in some more PHP tags, and I'm just going to put in the 5th step, which is MySQL close. So we're going to close the connection as the very last thing, and once again, we're using that handle for the connection, so it knows which connection to close, and that's it. That's all the steps that we have. So let's go ahead and try it out. Let's save that file. Switch back over, and we'll just reload the databases.php page. And sure enough, it returned back to us the subject that we put in the menu name field, followed by the position. And that's all there is to it. Now, of course, we could improve the SQL and come up with something better than this. We could, for example, tell it to order it by position. But I wanted to come up with something that was really simple that would show you how this all works. There's 2 last points that I want to make on this. The first is that because we used MySQL fetch array, we don't have to just use numbers to fetch those. It brings back an associative array, and we can refer to them also by name. So in this case, it would be menu name, and then the second one would, of course, be position. And we no longer have to remember what order they were declared and what order they're being returned to us. We can actually grab them by name, which is not only a lot easier to use, but it's a lot easier to go back and look at our code and know what we were trying to do than it is to use those array position numbers. So either one will work for us, but we're going to end up using the names 99% of the time. And the last point I want to make to you is that we don't always have to specify connection. It's a good habit to do it, But once we make this connection, PHP is going to assume that we're talking about the connection. We actually don't have to list the connection here. We don't have to list the connection again here. And we don't have to list the connection down here when we close it. It will assume you probably want to close the connection that's open that it already knows about. But it's, again, good programming habit to go ahead and tell it, here is the connection. You may see me do it both ways. I'm going to try and stay in the habit of always specifying it. So review those 5 steps, take a look at them, but keep in mind that every time we bring up a PHP page that's going to need to be connected to a database, and that's not just for our website, for every single page, we're going to need to do those first 2 steps. Then we'll do our database queries and work with the data. We can do as many of those as we need to do. And at the very end, we'll close our connection. So get used to that process. You can go ahead and try doing other SQL select statements in there. There's going to be a slightly different format when we work with inserts, updates, and deletes. And we'll cover that in a little bit. But for now, just get comfortable with how we can read records and make selections and display data back. And now that we understand MySQL and we understand how PHP can work with MySQL, we finally have enough tools at our disposal that we can create a web application. And in the next chapter, that's what we'll do.